village of Bethel, a collection of shacks on the Kuskokwim River. 2,500 natives live here. Who cares about them? In the past, no one. Out of these grim surroundings, they make an average income of $500 a year. Some of this comes from welfare handouts, and the rest from the salmon canning and freezing industry, which takes only the fish it wants. For 60 years, these people have lived at the mercy of the fishing interests whose control, in the past, has been complete. Something had to break. It did. With the help of Bruce Crow, a school teacher from Detroit, the natives of the Kuskokwim organized a cooperative with its own freezing plant, which provided them with a continuing source of food for themselves and allowed them to freeze their own fish so that they could sell whenever they wanted. With this plant, they released themselves from the grasp of the fishing interests and took control of their own lives.
Fish is a thing that they've worked with all their life and know, and as I fished with them 8 years ago, it became apparent to all of us who were fishermen that we were not getting a very good deal for our fish price-wise or in the ability to sell all our fish, so we started working together towards helping ourselves.
Markets were expanded, and there was a constant supply of food for the hard winter months. Bethel began to haul itself out of the poverty in which it had lived for so long. A modern cash economy was growing up. Then one night, the freezing plant burned down. The crisis was on. This year's catch might rot, or worse, the natives would be forced back into selling their best king salmon to the big fishing companies in Anchorage and Seattle, or the freezer ship Teddy, at whatever price they felt like paying. Things looked very bad for the fishermen of Bethel until the Alaska State Community Action Program, part of the War on Poverty campaign, stepped in and helped the Bethel fishermen to negotiate with a Japanese company which promised to send a freezer ship right to their own river to purchase their entire season's catch. This was a real breakthrough. Unlike the American buyers, the Japanese would take all grades of fish. For the first time in history, the native fishermen could look forward to selling all of their fish. The hard-working fishermen of Bethel appeared to be saved. Just when the Bethel fishermen seemed to be safe and out of trouble, their hopes were crushed again. Republican Governor Walter J. Hickles stepped in and vetoed the deal with the Japanese. The native fishermen, whose total catch is only a fraction of the multi-million-dollar industry, found themselves in the middle of a major political storm. Governor Walter J. Hickles claimed that the deal with the Japanese contravened international treaties. The federal government denied this. He then sent a task force of officials, including a state trooper, to Bethel to harass and threaten the fishermen with arrest and to create confusion in order to prevent the co-op from selling to the Japanese. The Japanese freezer ship had already arrived and was stationed right on their fishing grounds waiting to buy. The legal delays that were caused by the governor's moves forced the people of Bethel to sell their fish in Anchorage. There, 60,000 pounds of prime salmon were condemned as spoiled.
Originating live from the facilities of the Broadcast Center in Anchorage, Alaska, the governor's press conference.
Last year, Mr. William McBride set up a deal with the Japanese freezer ship in Kotzebue, and he earned your praise. This year, you prevented the Kuskokwim natives from doing business with a similar vessel. It is generally understood that Mr. McBride will again be doing business in this manner in the Kotzebue area this year. The question, sir, is why does the administration look with favor on one deal with the Japanese while with disfavor on another?
In the Kuskokwim last year, there were not any American processes available. And when the Japanese wrote me a letter, April the 26th, which I received around the 29th, asking for my opinion, they're coming into the Bethel area, I wrote to all the American processors that were available to Alaska. We received, I think it was 9 replies. And in that letter, I stated very clearly that if they were not able to process and purchase the catch out in the Bethel area, then we would bring the Japanese in.
Bruce Crow replied that no company had ever bought their entire catch or paid fair prices, both of which the Japanese were willing to do.
Mr. Crow,
Yes,
the manager of the co-op, has said throughout this whole dispute that the real reason the Japanese were asked in is because he hasn't felt the natives have had fair treatment from the American buyers that have been in the area. And he's named a whole list of things from prices not met to fish being allowed to spoil to the fish simply not being taken. Is anything being done by the state to protect these people against what really caused this thing?
Les, really, you know, they're asking the state to do an awful lot. I can believe that something like that happened, that Mr. Crow mentioned, that some of the fish weren't purchased, some were allowed to rot. But I say this, we recognize that too, and that's why we wrote to all the American processors and specifically said that if this were allowed to happen, we would invite the Japanese in. See, the Japanese could be legal if they were invited in, federal government or by the state government.
And our people will be fishing down there, so again, we want the highest price. If the Teddy will pay it, then we'll sell to her. If the Kitsamaru will pay it, with a custom operation through the Teddy, then we want to go that way. I just want the governor to know. He's complained publicly that he hasn't been informed prior to this fact.
The struggle of the poor people of Bethel to better their life was in the best American tradition. They were fighting for their rights to dignity and a decent way of life. But the established fishing interests, with the full help and backing of the governor, saw the efforts of the people of Bethel as a threat to profits and personal power, and they moved swiftly to crush it. The struggle showed that Bethel was blazing a trail which befitted the land of the last frontier, and that established interests, backed by the governor, saw this as a threat to personal power and the profits of big business.
To my phone number, which is 543-2478.
Democratic legislator George Homan makes the first of many abortive bids to reach the governor by telephone.
No, I'm calling from 543-2458. George Homan, H-O-H-M-A-N. Pardon me? I want to place a call to the governor, and he would be in June.
What I'm trying to help you people find is a market for your fish. And I know all you want to do is fish, and all you want to do is sell all your fish, and all you want is money for them. I understand that, but as manager of this cooperative, I need to know more about it, you know.
In desperation, George Homan flies to Anchorage to find the governor. He knows that Republican Governor Walter J. Hickel will never come to Bethel. While the fish rotted and the hopes and aspirations of the poor fishermen of Bethel went up in smoke, the Republican governor and his so-called task force did absolutely nothing. No planes were available to fly the fish out, and still the Japanese freezer ship Akitsamaru remained empty. Desperate pleas and calls for help by Bob Bartlett and Ernest Greening for the co-op were ignored by the governor and his task force. In Washington, U.S. Senator Bob Bartlett expresses concern about the Bethel co-op.
Now, in respect to the Bethel co-op, I frankly don't see that there would have been any great harm in allowing the natives there, or such of them as cared to sell their salmon, which they caught, to the Japanese freezer ship. I would very strenuously object to Japanese fishing in those waters or any of our territorial waters, or in fact, out to a distance 12 miles from the line of coast, because I'm the author of the bill, the federal law that prohibits foreign fishermen coming within 12 miles of our coast.
This is the governor's press conference live at the broadcast center.
I'm advocating free competition, and I don't think that protectionism is in anybody's long interest over a
Why did the federal government have a treaty then? Why did it negotiate with the Japanese? Why don't they just open it up? That's freedom.
Because every state has its own interest.
No, this is national. This isn't Alaska. This is national.
And if the state interest is strong enough, they're able to ram it through Washington.
Oh, we haven't rammed nothing through Washington. This is long before I became governor. This has been going back for 40 years. Now, if you want total freedom, free to murder, free to steal, free to covet, free to rape, that's freedom. That's total freedom, but that's permissive.
Listening to the governor speak, it was hard to tell whether the Bethel co-op angered him most because it flouted his personal authority, or was creating a precedent of free enterprise which challenged the 60-year-old monopoly of the fishing tycoon. Despite Republican Governor Walter J. Hickle's promises and his assurance that there were enough American freezer ships to take out the salmon catch, in the end, there was only one, and that one was already full. Eventually, under pressure, the governor was forced to compromise. The Bethel Co-op was allowed to sell to the Japanese ship, but not by free contract as they had originally planned. After many weeks of delay, the governor was allowed to save face by inviting the Japanese ship to buy. Yet, despite the difficulties created by Republican Governor Walter J. Hickle, the native fishermen of the Bethel Co-op have shown that in Alaska, rural industry can help the people to lift themselves from poverty to a decent living. It has shown that it is possible to stop the dependence on the welfare handout and develop a stable economy and the self-respect that goes with it. If the Bethel Co-op and other groups like it are to survive, they must not be crushed by harassment and legal and economic threats from big business, or worse still, by those in positions of great legislative power. Those men in high political office owe their positions to all of the people of Alaska, including the natives of the tiny fishing village of Bethel. The Democratic Party of Alaska believes in people, believes in initiative, believes in free enterprise, and believes in the people of